Have you ever experienced the sensation that you are the sole rational individual in a world that has descended into utter, spectacular chaos? That was my reality several years ago, as I stood at the entrance of one of my own storage units. This particular unit, which I knew to be unoccupied, was instead filled with a disorganized collection of possessions belonging to other people. Golf clubs, deflated Santa figures, what appeared suspiciously to be an entire collection of someone's ceramic cats, and the homeowners association from the adjacent property. When I eventually identified the party responsible for this unwanted interior arrangement, their president, a woman who brandished her clipboard as if it were a regal scepter, more or less instructed me to accept the situation. And accept it I did. Indeed, I accepted it in a manner that she and the entire HOA would recall for a very, very considerable time. This narrative extends beyond mere storage units. It concerns principle, it concerns audacity, and it concerns the splendid, painstaking, and wholly lawful deconstruction of a minor despot's small domain. My name is Arthur Henderson, and professionally, I am a retired civil engineer. I prefer things to be exact, methodical, and, most importantly, equitable. When I acquired a modest commercial plaza at the town's periphery, the property included a block of 20 self-storage units situated at the rear. These were not the primary motivation for the acquisition, but I reasoned, why not? A small stream of passive revenue. Maintain their cleanliness, ensure their security. It seemed straightforward. I handled their management personally. I was acquainted with every lessee and the status of each unit. Unit 17 had been unoccupied for 3 months, thoroughly cleaned, its lock verified. Or so I believed. During my routine monthly inspection, a simple visual survey of the access lanes to confirm everything appeared secure, I observed that Unit 17 was fitted with a brand new, rather costly-looking padlock. It was not one of my standard issue locks. A flicker of annoyance stirred within me. Could I have forgotten a new rental? Improbable. I maintained scrupulous records. A swift review of my ledger corroborated my thoughts. Unit 17 was still registered as vacant. No lease, no security deposit, no lessee identified as mystery occupant. My initial suspicion was a squatter, yet this was a secure, gated facility. Well, relatively secure. The gate served more as a discouragement than an impenetrable barrier. I affixed a courteous but firm notice to the unit. This unit appears to be occupied without a valid lease agreement. Please contact Arthur Henderson at my phone number immediately to rectify this situation or remove your belongings. I allowed 48 hours for a response. Nothing. No telephone call. The lock remained. My irritation was escalating into suspicion. This felt less like a desperate person seeking refuge and more like something different, something characterized by entitlement. I concluded that a little more surveillance was necessary. Possessing a couple of game cameras that I employ for monitoring deer on a friend's land, I discreetly installed one positioned to view the door of Unit 17. It did not take long to obtain my answer. The recorded footage revealed a woman with quite blonde hair, styled into an unyielding helmet, struggling to guide a large, ornate bird bath into the unit. She was trailed by a man in a polo shirt meticulously tucked into khaki shorts, carrying what seemed to be judging paraphernalia, ribbons and a small PA system. I recognized them. The woman was Carol Albright, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, the extensive development that adjoined my property to the east. The man was her perpetually agitated vice president, Gary. Willow Creek Estates was an organization with which I'd had minimal, albeit occasionally perplexing, interactions, primarily involving requests for me to prune trees they asserted were encroaching from my property, even when my land survey unequivocally demonstrated they were well within my boundaries. Carol Albright, specifically, was a woman who appeared to believe her HOA presidency bestowed upon her authority over a significantly broader area than the HOA bylaws permitted. She drove a pristine white Cadillac Escalade, the type that occupies 1.5 parking spaces, and invariably wore an expression suggesting she had just detected an offensive odor, which, in her presence, was often her own excessively floral perfume. So it was her. This was not a squatter situation. This was an infringement, a deliberate, unauthorized taking by an organized group that should have possessed better judgment. My annoyance ignited into a searing anger. This was not merely an error in judgment. This was hubris. The sort of hubris that presumes regulations are intended for others. The sort of hubris that was on the verge of encountering a very methodical, very patient, and increasingly incensed civil engineer. I preserved the footage, a slight, gratified smile touching my lips. This was merely the commencement. Carol Albright had no inkling of the person she was confronting. She perceived a quiet, older gentleman who owned some storage units. She failed to see the individual who had successfully managed intricate county zoning variances, contended with obstinate contractors, and comprehended the influence of meticulously documented facts. Oh, she was about to find out. I resolved to handle this calmly initially, to offer her an opportunity to retract, to acknowledge her error. I proceeded to the Willow Creek Community Clubhouse the following afternoon, a somewhat pretentious structure that always seemed to be in some state of enhancement. Carol was present, naturally, supervising the installation of a new, aggressively cheerful welcome mat. Miss Albright, I commenced, maintaining an even tone. I believe there has been a misunderstanding concerning Unit 17 at my storage facility. She turned, her eyes performing that slow blink some individuals use to signal complete lack of interest. Mr. Henderson, isn't it? From the establishment next door. The manner in which she uttered establishment made it seem as though I operated a disreputable junkyard. Yes, I affirmed. Unit 17 is presently occupied by items I believe are the property of the HOA. However, there is no lease agreement in effect. Her impeccably shaped eyebrows arched slightly. Oh, that. Yes, Gary took care of it. We required some additional space for the upcoming fall festival decorations and some of the pool equipment. It's merely temporary, as if that justified anything. Temporary or not, Miss Albright, it is my property. Utilization of a unit necessitates a lease and payment. She actually let out a titter, a brief, sharp noise like a startled avian. Surely, Mr. Henderson, you can allocate one small unit for the benefit of the community. It's practically unused otherwise. We are all neighbors here. Neighbors. Amusing how that designation only seemed relevant when she desired something. The benefit of your community, Miss Albright, does not encompass the unauthorized utilization of my private property. I require the unit to be vacated or a formal lease signed at the standard rate. Her smile faded, supplanted by a frigid demeanor. Well, I'm afraid we're quite occupied with festival preparations. The items will be taken out when we find the time. Perhaps you could demonstrate a bit more community-mindedness. The condescension was unmistakable. She reverted her attention to the welcome mat, a clear act of dismissal. It was at that moment I realized this would not be settled through polite discourse. This was an assertion of her intentions. She genuinely thought she possessed the right. My jaw clenched. Community-minded? Oh, I was about to become exceedingly community-minded, just not in the manner she anticipated. I departed, the game camera footage replaying in my thoughts. She had just provided me with the means. Now, I simply needed to allow her sufficient latitude. My engineering mind was already transitioning from courteous inquiry to strategic formulation. This was no longer solely about a storage unit. This was about principle. My subsequent action was to formalize all communications. Verbal exchanges with someone of Carol Albright's nature were evidently a futile expenditure of effort and an open door for misconstruction. I composed a polite yet firm letter addressed to the Willow Creek Estates HOA Board of Directors, care of Miss Carol Albright, President. I detailed the circumstances, the unauthorized occupancy of Unit 17, the date of its discovery, and the photographic proof I held of HOA representatives gaining entry to the unit. I unequivocally stated there are two alternatives. Either remove all HOA property from Unit 17 within 10 business days from the letter's date or execute a standard monthly lease agreement at the prevailing rate of $150 per month, retroactively applied to the estimated date of initial occupancy which my camera footage conveniently supplied. I also enclosed a copy of my standard lease agreement for their review. I dispatched this letter via certified mail with return receipt requested and additionally via email to the official HOA address found on their website, thereby creating a digital record. For good measure, I even hand-delivered a copy to the clubhouse mailbox. Excessive, perhaps, but my experience has taught me that when confronting difficult individuals or organizations, an abundance of documentation is never a misstep. Each action needed to be verifiable, every communication recorded. A week later, the green certified mail card returned, bearing a signature with a flamboyant style that could only belong to Carol. The email was indicated as read. Silence. Then, on the 9th business day, a letter arrived not from the entire board, but on HOA letterhead, signed exclusively by Carol Albright, President. It was a paragon of dismissive conceit. She acknowledged receipt of my communication and asserted that the HOA board had deliberated on the issue. I strongly doubted this. It was more probable that Carol had merely notified them of her unilateral decision and had benevolently chosen to propose $25 a month for the temporary and infrequent use of the unit. Framed as a gesture of goodwill for neighborhood harmony, she appended a condescending little sentence: "We trust this resolves your concerns and fosters a more cooperative spirit between our properties." Cooperative spirit. My teeth clenched. This was not cooperation, it was a deliberate affront, a display of power. She genuinely thought she could impose conditions on my own property. The sheer nerve was astonishing. It was evident she had not regarded my deadline with seriousness, nor the suggestion of ensuing consequences. Indeed, my game camera, which I had kept operational, revealed heightened activity. Not only was Unit 17 now visibly overfilled, but I observed Gary appearing even more agitated than usual, cautiously attempting to open the lock on Unit 18, which was also unoccupied. He failed to gain entry as I utilize high-security locks that I install myself. Yet the intention was unmistakable. They were not merely using one unit, they were considering expansion. This intensification, however, served my purposes perfectly. Her dismissive letter now constituted Exhibit B in my expanding dossier. I did not even deign to reply to her insulting proposal. Instead, I initiated the subsequent phase of my strategy. My forbearance was a tactical measure, not an indication of frailty, a misinterpretation Carol Albright clearly made. I allowed another week to elapse merely to ensure there was no uncertainty regarding her disregard for my reasonable conditions. Then I composed a second letter. This communication was less cordial, more official. It was a final notice prior to taking action. I referenced her letter, reiterated that her offer was unacceptable, and stated that if all HOA property was not removed from Unit 17 and any other units they might have surreptitiously occupied, I was covering my bases. Within 7 calendar days, and if a lease for the full amount, including back rent, was not signed and payment remitted, I would be compelled to consider all items within the units as abandoned property. I then clearly cited the relevant state statutes concerning the disposal of abandoned property in self-storage facilities, which typically involve a public auction. I ensured the language was precise, legally sound, and left no room for misinterpretation. Again, certified mail, return receipt, email with read receipt, and a hand-delivered copy. This time, I also included a clear photograph of the overstuffed Unit 17, date stamped by the game camera. Exhibit C. I was not bluffing about evidence. Throughout this interval, I maintained my discreet surveillance. The sheer assortment of articles crammed into Unit 17 was astounding. Beyond the fall festival items and pool maintenance supplies I could now discern through a slightly ajar door, they were not even meticulous about securing it properly, what appeared to be several sets of golf clubs, very costly ones, judging by the bags. A high-quality gas grill, numerous boxes marked holiday decorations, President's House, and even a pile of what seemed to be old campaign signs from Carol's previous HOA election. The President's House label was especially noteworthy. Were these genuinely community assets, or was Carol utilizing my facility as her personal, free-of-charge attic? The suspicion began to take firm hold. This was not merely HOA overstepping, this might be personal gain masked as community necessity. My determination solidified. This was no longer solely about reclaiming my unit, it was about revealing this flagrant misuse of authority. The 7-day deadline stipulated in my final notice drew near. On the 6th day, I received an email directly from Carol. No letterhead this time, just a brief, curt message: "Mr. Henderson, your continued harassment is uncalled for. The HOA is a nonprofit organization and we are very busy serving our residents. We will address the storage matter when the festival is over. Your threats are duly noted and considered highly unneighborly." Unmitigated audacity. She persisted in treating me like a trivial irritation and that to be dismissed at her convenience. She clearly did not believe I would act on my warnings. Individuals like Carol Albright function through bullying and intimidation. They seldom anticipate methodical, legally sound opposition. They expect you to become enraged, to shout, and then, ultimately, to capitulate. They do not foresee that you will scrutinize the fine print and employ it against them. The deadline expired. Silence. Perfect. I picked up the telephone and contacted a lawyer I had engaged a few years prior for a property boundary disagreement, a sharp individual named Ben Carter who specialized in real estate and contract law. I detailed the entire situation, transmitting to him copies of all correspondence, the photographs, and the video stills. He listened attentively. Upon my conclusion, there was a brief silence, followed by a soft chuckle from his end of the line. "Arthur," he remarked, "this woman sounds like a textbook case. But from what you've shared and the documentation you possess, you're in a very advantageous position. State law is quite explicit on this. You've afforded them every chance." He affirmed the procedures I needed to follow for a lawful auction of abandoned property, specific phrasing for the public announcement, the required frequency and locations for its publication, and the notice to be affixed to the unit itself. "Adhere to this precisely, Arthur," Ben counseled, "and she won't have a legal basis to contest it. In fact, she might find herself in considerable difficulty with her own HOA members when they discover her actions." That final remark was exceptionally pleasing to hear. The contest was truly underway. The subsequent morning, I had a formal notice of lien and intent to sell property professionally printed. It identified the tenant as Willow Creek Estates HOA, care of Carol Albright, President, Unit Number 17. The outstanding rent was calculated at my standard rate for the duration of their unauthorized occupancy plus late fees as per my standard, unagreed upon but now being enforced, lease terms, and a clear declaration that if the full amount was not paid and the property claimed within 15 days, the contents of Unit 17 would be sold at public auction to satisfy the lien. The notice specified the date, time, and location of the auction, my facility, 3 weeks hence on a Saturday morning. I conspicuously posted one on the door of Unit 17. I once more dispatched copies via certified mail and email to Carol and the HOA. Subsequently, I placed advertisements in the local newspaper and on a couple of online classified websites, precisely as mandated by state law and Ben's guidance. The advertisements were succinct and factual: public sale of abandoned property, Unit 17. My facility name and address, date, time. Contents appear to include holiday decorations, sporting goods, household items, etc. Sold as is, where's to the highest bidder. Cash only. For my records, I even photographed the notice posted on Unit 17 with the bulging contents visible behind it. I envisioned Carol encountering the newspaper advertisement. She would likely sneer, perhaps even chuckle, certain it was an intricate deception. He wouldn't dare, she would probably assert to her associates, possibly Gary, who by now likely sported a permanent facial tic from the strain of facilitating her schemes. But I would dare. I was daring. And I was daring meticulously, legally, and rather jubilantly. The countdown to auction day had commenced. Every legal I was dotted, every T crossed. Carol Albright believed she was engaged in a game of checkers with a simpleton. She was on the verge of realizing she was in a chess match with an engineer who had just guided her queen into an inescapable trap. The elegance of it was that she was performing most of the work herself through her own astounding arrogance. Auction day arrived, bright and clear, a perfect Saturday morning. I had engaged a professional auctioneer, a pragmatic man named Mike, who had conducted such events countless times. He came early and inspected Unit 17. That morning, I had removed Carol's expensive padlock, substituting it with one of my own, the key to which Mike now possessed. He whistled. "Quite the assortment in there, Art," he remarked, looking inside. "Resembles an exploded suburban garage." I had arranged a small table for registration and payment, along with a few folding chairs, although I did not anticipate a large attendance. These minor storage auctions typically attracted a few local resellers, inquisitive neighbors, and individuals hoping to discover a concealed valuable. By 9:45 a.m., approximately 15 minutes prior to the scheduled 10 a.m. commencement, a diverse group of about 20 individuals had congregated. A few recognizable faces from the vicinity, not from the HOA contingent, notably a couple of men with pickup trucks who appeared to be regular auction attendees and 1 or 2 women who seemed present purely for the entertainment. I experienced a serene sense of expectation. Everything was prepared. Then, at exactly 9:53 a.m., a gleaming white Cadillac Escalade screeched to a halt at the storage facility's entrance, its horn blaring. Carol Albright emerged, resplendent in a vibrant pink pantsuit that did little to diminish her irate expression. Accompanying her were Gary, looking as though he would prefer to be anywhere else on the planet, and another woman I identified as the HOA treasurer, a slender, anxious-looking person named Doris. "Henderson!" Carol shouted, striding towards me, her voice reverberating across the asphalt. "What is the meaning of this atrocity? You cannot sell our property. This is larceny." Her face was contorted with rage, the blonde coiffure appearing especially inflexible. The small assembly of auction attendees turned, their interest peaked. This was developing into a more diverting event than they had foreseen. I maintained perfect composure. I even produced a polite, if somewhat detached, smile. "Miss Albright, good morning. In accordance with the multiple legal notices served to you and the HOA and the public advertisements, this is a lawful auction to recover unpaid rent and fees for the unauthorized use of my storage unit." I held up a folder. "I have copies of all pertinent documentation right here, the certified mail receipts, the published notices, the photographs. Our previous correspondence. You were afforded ample opportunity to remove your association's belongings or to enter into a formal lease agreement. You opted for neither." Carol sputtered, "Documentation. This is persecution. Those items are essential to our community. You can't just sell them." Gary, to his credit, attempted to intervene. "Carol, perhaps we should have simply compensated the man." She cast him a glance that could curdle milk. "Silence, Gary. This is a matter of principle." Principle. She was still adhering to that notion. The auctioneer, Mike, stepped forward. "Ma'am, if you possess proof of payment or a current lease, we can certainly suspend the proceedings. Otherwise, Mr. Henderson is acting within his rights." Carol glared at him. "And who might you be?" "Mike Roston, licensed auctioneer, and we are scheduled to commence in 2 minutes." She glanced around erratically as if searching for a supporter in the crowd. Discovering only inquisitive and somewhat diverted faces, her anger escalated. "I'm summoning the police. This is unlawful." She fumbled for her mobile phone. "Please do, Miss Albright," I stated calmly. "I would be pleased to clarify the situation to them as well." True to her declaration, she jabbed at her phone, her voice escalating hysterically as she depicted the theft in progress. While she was thus engaged, Mike winked at me and declared, "All right, folks. 10 o'clock, let's begin with Unit 17. He unfastened the door and rolled it upward with a rattle, exposing the chaotic trove within. Gasps, then murmurs emanated from the crowd. It truly was an assorted collection. Holiday decorations, dozens of boxes, sporting equipment, those costly golf clubs, a couple of respectable bicycles, tennis rackets, the notorious bird bath, the PA system, stacks of files that likely contained HOA business now on the verge of being dispersed, and tucked in a corner, clearly visible, were the boxes explicitly labeled Holiday Decorations, President's House. I made certain to glance towards Carol as Mike indicated those. Her face, if feasible, became even redder. The bidding commenced. Mike was proficient, eliciting bids for individual items and small groupings. A set of slightly used Christmas lights sold for $5. A box of bewildered-looking ceramic squirrels garnered $10. The high-end gas grill, following some enthusiastic bidding between 2 resellers, achieved a very respectable $250. The golf clubs, which Carol kept shrieking were irreplaceable custom clubs belonging to a respected member, were acquired for $400 by a man who appeared to discern his titlists from his callowes. Each sale was akin to a small hammer strike against Carol's composure. She paced, she fumed, she made vociferous declarations about suing me into financial ruin. The police did arrive, 2 composed officers who listened patiently to Carol's tirade, then to my quiet explanation, supported by my folder of evidence. One of them, Officer Miller, whom I knew vaguely from a neighborhood watch meeting years ago, reviewed my paperwork. He nodded. "Ma'am," he addressed Carol, "as far as we can ascertain, Mr. Henderson has adhered to all legal procedures for an abandoned property auction. This is a civil matter. We cannot intervene unless there's a disturbance of the peace." Carol looked aghast. "Disturbance of the peace? He's disturbing the peace by stealing our property." Officer Miller simply gave her a steady look. "You'll need to address that with the courts, ma'am. For now, this auction is proceeding lawfully." He and his partner then advised Carol to lower her voice and refrain from interfering, or she might be the one disturbing the peace. That silenced her momentarily, though she continued to glare fiercely at everyone involved. The public humiliation was clearly a novel and disagreeable experience for her. The auction proceeded for another hour. The boxes labeled President's House were especially noteworthy. They held not merely holiday items, but also what appeared to be personal trinkets, old photo albums, and even a collection of rather ostentatious porcelain dolls. These did not command high prices, but the symbolic triumph of witnessing Carol Albright's personal accumulation being sold for minimal amounts was immense. Gary and Doris, the treasurer, looked progressively wretched, clearly wishing the ground would engulf them. Finally, the last item was sold. The unit was vacant, apart from a few dust bunnies and a persistent scent of Carol's indignation. Mike totaled the revenue. After subtracting my calculated back rent at $150 per month for the 4 months they had occupied it, plus the legally mandated late fees, the cost of the advertisements, and Mike's commission, there was actually a surplus of a few $100s. In accordance with the law, this surplus legally belonged to the defaulting tenant, the HOA. I had Mike prepare a formal receipt and a check for the surplus amount, payable to Willow Creek Estates HOA. I approached the area where Carol was still seething, flanked by her dispirited associates. "Miss Albright," I said, extending the check and receipt. "Here is the remaining balance from the auction proceeds after all outstanding debts and costs were settled. Please ensure this is appropriately recorded in the HOA's accounts." She stared at the check as if it were a poisonous serpent. She did not accept it. Doris, the treasurer, however, hesitantly reached out and took it, murmuring a barely discernible "thank you." Carol just pivoted on her heel and strode back to her Escalade, Gary hurrying after her. As she wrenched open the car door, she delivered one final venomous glare. "You will regret this, Henderson. You will regret this more than anything you've ever done." I just smiled faintly. Somehow I doubted that. The purchasers were contentedly loading their newly acquired items. My unit was empty. I had my funds, and I had an intuition that the true spectacle was only just commencing. I immediately proceeded to install a brand new, even more secure lock on Unit 17, and then on Unit 18 for good measure. The feeling of contentment was profound. It took less than a week for the official-looking envelope to arrive. Summons and complaint, Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association versus Arthur Henderson. They were suing me for unlawful seizure and sale of HOA property, conversion, a legal term for wrongfully appropriating someone else's property, trespass, presumably for entering their unit to conduct the auction, and a variety of other fabricated accusations. They were seeking damages that were, to put it mildly, fantastical, asserting the unit's contents were valued at tens of thousands of dollars, including irreplaceable community artifacts and items of considerable sentimental worth. Carol Albright was clearly not one to concede defeat with grace. She was intensifying her efforts, aspiring to overwhelm me with legal expenses and intimidate me into surrender. She had once again gravely misjudged her adversary. I promptly telephoned Ben Carter, my lawyer. "Well, Arthur," he remarked after I emailed him the documents, "can't say I'm surprised. People like her detest losing, especially in public. But they've just wandered into a minefield." Ben was positively exultant. "This isn't a problem, Arthur. This is an opportunity. The discovery process on this is going to be very, very interesting." Our defense was uncomplicated. We had meticulously adhered to every provision of the state law concerning abandoned property in self-storage facilities. We submitted our response, refuting all their allegations and enclosing copies of every piece of documentation I had gathered. The letters, the certified mail receipts, the photographs, the video stills of Carol and Gary filling the unit, the public notices of the auction, the auctioneer's comprehensive accounting, and even the check for the surplus proceeds that Doris had accepted. Ben also filed a counterclaim for attorney's fees, citing the baseless nature of their lawsuit. Then commenced discovery. This is the stage of a lawsuit where both parties can request information and documents from the other and conduct depositions, sworn testimonies taken outside of court. And this, as Ben foresaw, was where Carol Albright's meticulously built facade began to collapse dramatically. Ben dispatched a thorough request for documents to the HOA, soliciting all board meeting minutes related to the storage unit, all internal communications regarding it, any inventories of the stored items, and detailed financial records demonstrating the purchase and ownership of the purportedly valuable items. He also scheduled depositions for Carol Albright, Gary, and Doris, the treasurer. The initial document production from the HOA was revealing due to its omissions. There were no official board meeting minutes authorizing the use of my storage unit. No formal votes, merely nebulous references in Carol's President's Report section about securing temporary storage for festival items. When Ben pressed for inventories or proof of purchase for the high-value items they claimed, they produced very little. A few faded receipts for some plastic tables and the PA system. Nothing for the expensive golf clubs or the high-end grill. Doris, the treasurer, was the first to be deposed. She was a bundle of nerves. Under Ben's calm but persistent questioning, she conceded that Carol had simply informed the board she had made an arrangement for storage. Doris confessed she'd had reservations but was unwilling to confront Carol. She also admitted that many of the holiday decoration boxes were, to her knowledge, items Carol brought from her own residence each year for the clubhouse and subsequently retrieved. She had no knowledge of who owned the golf clubs, but had observed Carol's husband using a similar set. Gary's deposition was even more enlightening. He was plainly terrified of Carol, but also weary of being her scapegoat. He admitted Carol had directed him to find someplace cheap or free for the items because the HOA's own small storage shed was full largely, he sheepishly admitted, with items Carol had deemed too significant to dispose of but did not want at her own house. He confirmed Carol had dismissed my letters dismissively, referring to me as a grasping old man. He also, crucially, admitted that when he had seen my final notice before action, he had implored Carol to simply pay the rental fee, but she had refused, stating, "He won't dare do anything. We're the HOA. He needs us more than we need him." But the true spectacle was Carol Albright's deposition. She entered with her lawyer, a polished, overly self-assured man who evidently regarded this as a trivial annoyance case. Carol was arrogant, confrontational, and repeatedly attempted to evade questions. Ben, however, was like a patient bulldog. He would re-engage, rephrase, and calmly corner her. The critical moment arrived when Ben presented enlarged, date-stamped photos from my game camera depicting Carol herself, not HOA volunteers, loading boxes clearly marked Personal CA and Attic Overflow Albright into Unit 17. Her lawyer attempted to object, but the judge had already deemed them admissible. Carol's face turned ashen beneath her customary layer of makeup. Those are items I lend to the community for events," she stammered. Ben then presented the auctioneer's detailed inventory list, cross-referencing items sold with those very labels. "So, Miss Albright," Ben inquired gently, "these personal items that you lent to the community, you are now suing Mr. Henderson for their value on behalf of the HOA, claiming they were HOA property?" She struggled, attempting to bluster her way out, but the harm was inflicted. It became overwhelmingly evident that a substantial portion of the items stored in my unit, for which she was now suing me using HOA funds, were her own personal possessions she was storing without charge. This was not merely unauthorized use. This was potential misuse of HOA funds and a breach of her fiduciary duty. The conclusive evidence was not a single item, but an entire volley, culminating in her own incriminating admissions and the unambiguous photographic proof. News of the depositions, especially the disclosures about Carol's personal items, began to circulate among the Willow Creek Estate's residents. Individuals who had naively trusted her or had been too cowed to challenge her suddenly found their resolve. The HOA's subsequent community meeting, I later learned, was a rather animated event with residents demanding explanations about the lawsuit, the legal expenditures, and precisely whose property had been auctioned. The foundation was definitively shifting beneath Carol Albright's costly, likely HOA-funded footwear. The repercussions from the depositions were swift and severe for Carol Albright. Her lawyer, the polished individual who had likely assured her this was an open and shut case, suddenly became much more receptive to discussing a settlement. Ben Carter, my lawyer, was resolute. "Arthur isn't paying a cent," he informed them. "In fact, your client is going to drop this unfounded lawsuit with prejudice, meaning she can never file it again, and the HOA is going to cover Mr. Henderson's complete legal fees. Otherwise, we proceed to summary judgment, and I can assure you the judge will not be amused by Ms. Albright's abuse of the legal process and her apparent self-dealing." The HOA's lawyer must have perceived the inevitable outcome because within a week they conceded. The lawsuit was dismissed. The HOA, following a highly contentious emergency board meeting where Carol was reportedly severely reprimanded by newly emboldened board members and an audience of irate homeowners, issued a check for my legal expenses. It was not a princely sum, but it covered every cent Ben had billed me plus a small additional amount for my time and inconvenience, which Ben had astutely negotiated as administrative costs incurred due to frivolous litigation. But Carol's difficulties were far from concluded. The disclosures from the discovery process had unleashed a torrent of problems within Willow Creek Estates. Homeowners, now equipped with facts rather than mere suspicions, insisted on a comprehensive audit of the HOA's finances and Carol's conduct during her presidency. Several residents whose donated items for community events had mysteriously appeared in Unit 17 and were subsequently auctioned were incensed. It transpired that Carol had been utilizing the HOA as her personal moving and storage service for years, not solely with my facility but in other subtle manners always presented as being for community advantage. The audit, when eventually finalized by an independent firm, revealed numerous irregularities, questionable expenditures, contracts granted to acquaintances without competitive bidding, and, naturally, the entire fiasco with my storage unit where she had clearly misrepresented the situation to the board and then employed HOA funds to pursue a personal vendetta via the lawsuit. While direct, massive court-imposed fines weren't the outcome in my specific case, the consequences for Carol were financially and reputationally calamitous. The new HOA board, elected after Carol was unceremoniously removed in a special vote of no confidence, initiated legal action against her to recover the misspent legal fees for the lawsuit against me. The value of HOA property lost due to her negligence, and even the rent they effectively had to pay me via the auction proceeds for the unit she had essentially commandeered for her personal effects. They also reported her to a state oversight body for homeowners associations, citing breach of fiduciary duty, which I later heard led to considerable personal penalties for her. She was, in essence, penalized by the very community over which she had presided. My life reverted to its tranquil, methodical state. Unit 17, and indeed all my units, remained securely leased to legitimate, paying tenants. I enhanced my facility's main gate with a more substantial system, just as a precaution. However, the new Willow Creek HOA board proved to be sensible and refreshingly devoid of drama. Their new president, a reserved accountant named David, actually came over to personally apologize for the entire incident, shaking his head and commenting, "Some people just can't manage a little bit of authority, can they?" I merely smiled. "No, David, some people cannot." Carol Albright, I heard, sold her house in Willow Creek Estates at a financial detriment, rumors suggested, due to the scandal temporarily marring the neighborhood's image, and relocated out of state. Her white Escalade was no longer a common sight in the vicinity, and the local air quality marginally improved from the diminished concentration of her assertive floral perfume. Reflecting on it, it was an absurd degree of stress and exertion over a single storage unit. But it was never solely about the unit, was it? It concerned confronting a bully, the principle that one cannot simply appropriate what is not theirs, irrespective of how significant one believes oneself to be. My meticulous record-keeping, my insistence on adhering to legal procedures scrupulously, and a competent lawyer, those were my tools. And they proved far more potent than Carol Albright's bluster and sense of privilege. It simply demonstrates that sometimes the quiet, methodical strategy is the most formidable. So, that is the account of how I came to auction off an HOA president's personal possessions and unintentionally sparked a revolution in the adjoining neighborhood. It was, as the saying goes, quite an experience. And, for a period, I likely did hold the distinction for the most legally sound, thoroughly documented, and ultimately gratifying eviction of a rogue HOA's accumulated items.